All right. So I am going to continue where we left off last week, and we were looking at the way I'm describing it, the quarrel between the ancients and the moderns, on their views of what kind of creatures we are, right? And so we are right in the middle of our discussion of thinking about thinking, and my reason for framing this topic is because I guess, concerned at least that we are in the middle of a major technological revolution that I think really is showing new and quite unprecedented possibilities to what our machines can do, right? That we're on the verge of or beginning to enter an era of intelligent machines. And this leads us to, I think, wonder, first of all, how intelligent machines may differ from human beings and in terms of our intelligence, our capacity for thought. And one reason to wonder that, and this is ultimately where I hope we will go with these themes, is to wonder to what degree our aims and the aims of the machines we build, but that will increasingly display perhaps forms of intelligence that rival or supersede our own, to what degree will our aims converge, right? Will the machines we build just do what we want them to do? And the second related concern is to what degree will we be modified? Will we change our ways of thinking as we share the world with uh, devices that we have engineered that now think in alien ways from the way we think, are perhaps faster and more powerful at least a certain range of operations, but may also just do things differently from the way we do them. And so getting clear about how we think, I think, is extremely important at this moment. It's also just a good, fun topic to spend some time on before we get back into the hurly-burly of contemporary politics. And so I want to say just a little bit more before I get back to Plato and Aristotle and forward to Descartes and Kant and Nietzsche. The idea that how we think about our own life of the mind, our own internal subjectivity, mental processes, is not a self-standing topic, as we're about to see, right? We've seen, beginning with Plato, um, the metaphysical view you have. Are we created in the image of God, or are we evolved from other primates and ultimately from much simpler forms of life? The view that you have about ontology, what there is there a purpose or telos to things, or are they just the workmanship of blind evolution? Um, Determines in part how you think about what you're doing when you're thinking. And by the way, I've suggested already in thinking through some methodological issues in terms of the difference between philosophy and psychology when we spoke about those themes last week, that one way to describe us is as self-interpreting animals. And in saying that, I mean that our interpretations of what we are doing when we are thinking, when we are judging, what kinds of aims or purposes we are capable of realizing given the capacities that we have, perhaps what kinds of duties having those capacities imposes upon us, that range of issues forms at least partially a conception of the self, an idea of who I am. And I tend to act on the basis of that conception, right? We all tend not just to interpret ourselves in the ways in which we might interpret a work of art we're seeing in a museum, but to integrate that interpretation of the self into the plans we form, the aspirations we have, the expectations we have on ourselves. And so, as we conceive of ourselves in certain respects, so we end up being. And so there's a lot at stake here. Now, having said all of that, as I tried to outline in the first lecture, I'm starting with philosophy because I think of philosophy and this long historical discourse as containing the introspective reports of some of our most interesting minds on what they see when they look in upon themselves, right? And so the painting by Ribera of Socrates looking in a mirror, right? This is the discourse we're in the middle of. And I think it has some of the most profound and interesting interpretations of our mental life. But having said that, I also want to suggest, and I'm reading a fair bit of computer science and cognitive science these days, if we start sharing the world with intelligent machines that are built by us using neural networks that are based in computer programs, it seems to me quite probable that we are going to alter our self interpretations and start thinking of ourselves perhaps more as machines. One of the things that many historians will point out to you, intellectual historians, is that, right, the era of the mechanical clock, we've had mechanical clocks for some 700 odd years, and they became more and more ubiquitous, and they changed our relationship to time quite clearly, right? The fact that we could precisely measure out not just the hours, but the minutes and the seconds of the day led us to more precisely manage our lives and the activities we engage in. But having said that, it also changed the way we thought about ourselves. If we can see the springs and the gears and the wheels and recognize that the interaction of a complex machinery produces this simple but precise output that allows us to keep track of time quite accurately, maybe something like that is going on inside us as well. And this metaphor of the human being as containing a watchworks is very influential in the period of the Renaissance and the early Enlightenment. And so, are we going to start interpreting ourselves differently? And how much will that change what we do, what we aspire to do, our self conceptions? And should we perhaps resist some of that power that the metaphor gives, right? And so let me not go more deeply into this. Just to refresh your memory, I suggested that we have two different traditions of thinking about thinking, one which is an introspective and philosophical tradition, the other which is an objectivating and psychological tradition. And that from where I sit in this course, I don't think we have to choose between those two traditions so much as to recognize both the powers and the limits that each of those traditions offers us in thinking about the self. And so we are starting with the philosophical tradition. We will continue that way this week, but ultimately, I do also want to introduce you to a fair bit of work on contemporary psychology and the way in which it interprets the self. We concluded last week talking about Plato and the allegory of the cave and the idea that in order to get reliable knowledge, we had to escape the deception of both our senses and the world and engage in a form of pure intellectual contemplation akin to mathematics, where as opposed to numbers representing something in the world, I have three grapes, the number gets abstracted from the world. And now I'm just looking at the number three and its properties. Is it a prime number? And what is the relevance of that to my understanding of the nature of the number three, right? And that in order to be capable of being governed by reason and using our reason to contemplate higher and deeper truths to get to the suprasensory realm as opposed to the illusory realm of the senses, we need to organize both ourselves and our societies. We need to organize ourselves so that the other parts of my soul and my psyche are ultimately tamed and controlled sufficiently to allow reason to govern and do its work. If I'm constantly being pushed around by my emotions and my desires, I'm not going to have the quietude required, the uh, concentration, the peace of mind necessary for the intellect to do its work. And this then suggests not only that I need to organize my psyche, my soul, but almost certainly that I need help in doing this, and that therefore I need to live in a society with an education system and a form of governance that selects the people who are equipped to do this, allows them to cultivate their talent, and ultimately to rule. So, the other person in this, the image from Raphael's the School of Athens, is Aristotle, right? And Aristotle famously is a student of Plato's, and yet ultimately reacts against Plato and offers a very different conception. And I want to emphasize from the beginning, although, right, these are two men who know each other, who come out of the same culture and live in the same time, there are radical differences in them. And this points to, I think, the contestability of the ways in which we interpret ourselves. That doesn't mean they're purely subjective, right? There's a reason that we're still studying Plato and Aristotle some 2,500 years later, which is that their systems of thought are among the monuments to the human intellect ever created, right? That they contain these fabulous resources that have been incredibly valuable across not just centuries, but millennia. And yet, the idea that one of these guys got it right and the other one got it wrong, I think is hard to sustain. They provide us with toolkits for thinking about ourselves, our world, metaphysical issues, physical issues as well. In the case of Aristotle, the nature of causation, for instance, that are um, on the one hand incredibly productive, and on the other hand incompatible with each other, and that the nature of the enterprise of interpreting the self does not allow us to say, that one is clearly right, that one is clearly wrong. So with that background, let's move into Aristotle for a few minutes, and starting with the idea of a teleology to be found in the analysis of the ends of things. And one of the things that you see in Raphael's image is Plato is pointing up and Aristotle is pointing out. And Plato is suggesting that there are forms that are metaphysical entities that we come to know through pure intellect and without the use of sensation. And Aristotle is suggesting actually that the form is inseparable from the object in which it is instantiated, and that if we want to know what makes a good knife good, we don't study the concept of the good and then apply it to knives. we study knives and see what we want from knives. Is it a cutting knife for cooking? Is it a throwing knife for fighting? Is it a knife that we're using on a camping trip to whittle down a steak that we're going to use to hold up our tent? Different knives are good for different things given their role in our lives and the world. And so Aristotle's view is still a metaphysical view, and I want to be as clear as possible about this, that there is a purpose or an end, an aim to everything, and that understanding the thing requires understanding the aim of the thing. The classic example here is the example of the acorn that Aristotle employed, and then many people since him have used, that we would be completely confused if we thought the purpose of the acorn was to be food for squirrels, right? That is one of the things that happens to acorns sometimes. But having said that, the acorn is produced because it aims to become its purpose, its justifying end, a oak, and not just a sapling or a stunted, but a complete full-grown magnificent oak. So not every acorn obviously realizes its end. Some are gobbled up by squirrels, some are deposited in rocky patches where they can't possibly grow and just deteriorate. But some of them do actually realize that end. We are all familiar with magnificent oaks, and the fact that that is what they aim for helps us to understand what they really or truly are. Their core nature is to realize their fundamental purpose, what they aim at. And so with that basic worldview, Aristotle then turns to human beings and says, what is our nature? And his basic claim is that unlike most other creatures, we are capable of what he calls eudaimonia. And that's as opposed to hedomonia or hedonism, the word we now use, a complete kind of happiness, not mere pleasure, not satisfaction of our base desires and instincts, but activation through practice of our higher capacities, the kind of pleasure that we get when we are in the company of our lifelong friends, when we are sitting around together discussing wonderful ideas, when we play chess really well, is a higher pleasure than the pleasure we get when we have a nice piece of chocolate, etc., a more bodily or sensory pleasure, because our highest capacities, our capacities for creativity and critical thinking, discourse, and logic are realized through the higher activities. And one of the things that then is characteristic about Aristotle, because this is a metaphysical worldview, there are contemporary thinkers who say, yes, we have to be attuned to the fact that our highest pleasures are not to be found in the sensory or sensual, but in the more complex activities. John Stuart Mill is famously one of these thinkers, but it's up to each human being to decide which of the various potential employments of their capacities provides them with their complete happiness and perfection. Aristotle thinks really, no, it's in our nature, and that our nature contains two main pathways to human perfection. One of them is the life of action. and that is fundamentally a political condition. For that to be possible, we need to live in a society that gives the individual the potential to be a citizen, and citizens the power to determine the collective life of their society. We need also to have forms of education and civil society that prepare us ultimately for the life of action, for debating with our equals what our shared course of action is going to be, for ultimately trying to determine the course of our collective life. That this is a project and a form of activity that calls out in us the full range and complexity of our human capacities, especially our capacity for freedom, because not only is it not determined in advance what our collectivity is going to do. Are we going to go to war or not? Are we going to build a library or a school or perhaps a market, right? And so there's collective freedom, but it's also the case that there's a kind of individual freedom here, that we do not know how we're going to act, how we're going to distinguish ourselves, whether we're going to be eloquent or bumble, or even more importantly, often what precise course of action we're going to urge on our fellow citizens until we're in the group and seeing the reaction of our equals to our proposals. And that, for Aristotle, completes us, perfects us, if we're able to have that kind of life. He suggests that there's at least one other uh, form of human life that also perfects our capacities and therefore realizes our highest purpose and highest form of satisfaction, and that is the life of contemplation. This is not per se a solitary life. We may need teachers and people to engage in dialogue with, but it's not the life of action. It's not the give and take of ideas in which we're trying to persuade each other. We're trying to figure things out for ourselves in the life of contemplation. We're trying to think through the deepest questions. What is the nature of causation? What is the human good? And that when we are engaged in sustained contemplation of the most important ideas, again, we pull out of ourselves the highest happiness, the highest satisfaction, and the highest perfection that human beings are capable of. And so Aristotle starts from the idea that each creature has its purpose, its justifying aim, its telos, and then seeks to discern what the purpose or aim of all things are, ultimately to give us a account that is going to instruct us in what we should do with our lives, either a life of political action or a life of philosophical contemplation. By the way, the life of philosophical contemplation for Aristotle typically involves travel and comparison, right? We need to open up some critical distance between the received way of doing things in the place that we are, and or the place that we're born, the place we take for granted, the place that we've been raised, and other possible ways of doing things. To do that requires more than just critical thought. It requires some exposure to difference, and that requires either literally getting out of the place you are currently located in to see how things are done elsewhere. And it's worthwhile noting the term theory is ultimately derived from the Greek word for travel, or alternatively, it involves exposing yourself, reading the laws, the Constitution, the literature, of the religious systems of other places, other cultures, in order to come to grips with them. Why don't I just pull up for a moment? I obviously have more to cover, but I'm basically done with my quick introduction to Aristotle. And I want to just make sure before we move on, any questions or thoughts about this brief introduction to Aristotle's idea that we have objective ends, purposes in life, and that they're actually two main ends, and they push in different directions, right? And in different points in his life, Aristotle seemed to equivocate. Is one better than the other? I'm not going to enter that debate today, but the life of politics is a life of action. The life of contemplation is a life that involves pulling out of the determination of what we're going to do together and concentrating on deeper ideas that can be studied in isolation from each other. Thoughts or questions before I push into the uptake of Aristotle and Plato by the Christian tradition? Is this, I hope, making sense, somewhat familiar? Um,
It's all pretty heavy.
yeah. Well, hopefully heavy in a good way. I'm trying to actually not do what I would do at Sarah Lawrence. We would spend weeks on Aristotle, but to give you at least a little taste of what he's trying to suggest about the nature of the human mind and its lessons for how we should lead our lives. All right, I'm going to jump back in, and I do want to actually get forward to some modern ideas today, and so let me immediately just say, whenever you have a question, you know me at this point. Unmute yourself, put it in the chat, ask away. You don't have to wait for me to come out of the slides, please. Um, and so the next thing I want to say, and this is kind of an excuse for fast forwarding nearly 2,000 years, is that there was a moment, maybe moment is too precise, but there was a long-standing tendency in Western culture, especially as Christianity became the dominant religion, especially because of its incorporation as the official religion of the Roman Empire, of Western Europe, of Europe as a whole, eventually, that Christian theology uh, got a lot of resources that might have gone to philosophy, right? That the people who were paid to study ideas, the people who were given the leisure, the time, the library, the resources necessary to elaborate complex conceptions of what human nature is, were dominantly employed by churches, right? Especially by the Catholic Church, and that relatively early in the history, especially of Catholic theology, the ideas of Plato and Aristotle were taken up and used to elaborate Christian theology. And so, to be as clear as possible, this very idea, theology, right, that there can be an elaboration of revelation that was given to human beings about the nature of God. That idea is, in a sense, deeply informed by philosophy, right? And in this history, there's this idea of the wedding of Jerusalem and Athens, where Jerusalem represents the Abrahamic tradition and the tradition in particular of prophetic revelation, in which a Moses or a Jesus or a Jeremiah says, God has inspired me or revealed to me the following. And it really doesn't matter whether it's logical, whether it makes sense, whether it coheres as an argument or presents a fully fleshed out worldview. What matters is that God told it to me. And, who am I to judge God's revelation by the limited lights of my reason? Well, that may work if you're a charismatic prophet and you can convince the people around you that you really have been instructed by God to share this message with them. But if that charismatic prophet has been dead for centuries, if what we're now dealing with is merely the textual record of what the people around him say he said or taught, or the record of his life, then you tend to run into a problem, which is that ordinary people start to say, well, I'm not sure. Does that make sense? Is all of that consistent? And as religion becomes routinized, as it becomes structured bureaucratically, as opposed to it being carried by the inspired followers, now there's an institution that tries to make sure that everybody in society has a sufficient understanding of the religion that their salvation can be secured, because these are expansionistic religions. They actually want to get everybody indoctrinated into the teachings of the religion. You need to be able to answer those nagging questions. Wait, does that make sense? What do you mean that God is God, but also the Son and the Spirit? How can he be three things at once? And the tools that were available for elaborating and defending theological worldviews were given to us, or the I shouldn't put it that way. The tools that were available at the time, third, fourth, fifth century of the Common Era, were philosophical tools, right? That was the tradition of Athens that had been taken up very much in Rome and began to disseminate through other parts of Europe, and so it became quite natural to use philosophical tools to elaborate religious ideas, and especially to try to make sense of perhaps thorny and even incoherent issues in religious texts. The question of whether this is a happy wedding or instead a shotgun wedding, whether in fact, in the effort to make revelation conform to the standards of philosophical logic and coherence, we might actually have blunted the force of the vision that was announced to a prophet, or failed to recognize that the claim was not that this was a philosophical or reasoned argument, so much as this is something that you don't understand, but nevertheless, given that it is the revelation of God, you have to fall in line with it. It's human hubris to think that we can work out God's ideas so they conform with our ideas of logic and reason. But having said all of that, it appears, frankly, that the philosophers, or the people who had philosophical background, got the upper hand in the early church. And the result is that many of the ideas of Aristotle and Plato get incorporated into Christianity in the form of the doctrine of the Catholic Church. Some also Eastern Orthodoxy, but I'm not going to concentrate on that today. But among other ideas, that God is the foundation of true knowledge, right? That what Plato was looking for, an ultimate foundation that escapes the illusions of the world, the fluidity and unreliability of our senses, can be found through contemplation, but not philosophical contemplation, theological contemplation. Prayer and the study of revelation is the foundation of all true and secure human knowledge. That we are created in God's image, right? As the Bible tells us in Genesis. And what that means in the theological tradition is not that we look like God, not that we somehow have his or its physical appearance, but that he allowed us to partake in one essential attribute of his nature, which is to have reason, and reason that is obviously not divine, not omniscient, but that is sufficient to be able to understand his teachings. And so our reason is a divine endowment that is our pathway to salvation. And so I hope you can hear, right, the idea that we do have a purpose, that our purpose is reflected in the fact that we are created beings, that we're created by God to have reason, that reason allows us to understand his teaching, and that understanding his teaching allows us to have secure, true knowledge. All of those ideas, right, are translations of originally philosophical ideas into theological discourse. And of course, that doesn't mean that theology is covert philosophy, that this is a Trojan horse via which Plato and Aristotle were smuggled into ever wider populations. I think that the revelation as contained in the the works of Christian religion obviously survive as well. But nevertheless, there's a lot of philosophy that is incorporated into the theology that becomes the dominant theology of the next 1500 years. And I'm going to leave it at that for the Christian tradition, other than to draw a few conclusions of the overall composite that results from bringing together Platonism, Aristotelianism, and Christian doctrine. The first of the ideas that I think characterizes this amalgam is non-naturalism. We are fundamentally different from animals. We may have animal aspects to our nature, but what makes us valuable, what makes us special, what gives us dominion over the animals and the earth is the fact that we also partake of something that is not natural, that is supranatural, above nature, and that is our reason and the fact that we have had essential metaphysical truths revealed to us. The second, I think, critical idea here, and with apologies for the jargon, is that the perspective that you as an individual occupy does not matter, that reason is common to us all, that reason, no matter who is using it, gets us to the same results. And so when it comes to the truth, whether that is metaphysical or religious or even practical truth, we should all reach the same conclusions. Our particular perspectives are irrelevant. And to put it in the strongest language possible, the perspective of truth is the God's eye view, is the view of the universe, as it's sometimes called. It's not the view from here or there, my perspective or your perspective. There's one right answer, and that trumps whatever differences may come from the differences we have given our experiences. The third aspect of this tradition, very quickly, is that the foundation that it constructs for all knowledge, for our security in our understanding of ourselves, is not a kind of existential introspection. Who am I? What do I feel? What matters to me? It is metaphysical, ontological, theological, which is to say, right, it is grounded in ideas that transcend the individual experience of herself or himself. There is a right answer about what a good human life is. That answer is not to be found by asking yourself, what makes me happy or what makes me tick? It's to be found in the nature of the human per se, in the nature of the purposes for which we are created. Um, Fourth idea, that although all of this is universally true, it is not the case that each of us is well equipped to discover this, right? We're going back now to Plato's idea that there are different kinds of human nature, gold and silver and bronze, and that depending upon where you are in the great chain of being, you may have a complete understanding or almost no understanding of this. And so those who are in fact illuminated, who have understood God's teaching, have a responsibility to make sure that the rest of us fall into line. And I will just point out, right, that there's um, a dualism in all of this. The idea that we have a soul, the idea that we are endowed by God with reason, and that this is what makes us truly human as opposed to our animal nature. That all of this suggests that there are two different aspects to the human being, our animality and our divinity. And that although ultimately in the thought we're about to trace from Descartes to Kant to Nietzsche, there's an effort to overcome some of this dualism. This dualism also continues to exercise a powerful hold even on modern philosophy. So let me just pause again for a moment. I just want to make sure that this is making sense, and to see if you have questions or thoughts before we move on. Anybody got anything they want to ask or try to think through together? Go ahead. David, please.
Yeah, could you just elaborate a little more on this essential dualism, exactly what it is that's dualistic? I'm a little fuzzy on that.
Yeah, so let me try to put it in terms that are probably more familiar. Mind, body, right? So we have this, capacity to think, but we are also embodied creatures. But what distinguishes us, what allows us to ultimately identify knowledge and our higher purposes or aims is not our body but our mind, right? That's a idea that we tend to associate with Descartes, um, but it's an idea that has deep roots in Catholic theology, which in turn has deep roots in this Greco-Roman philosophical tradition, right? And so while Descartes is setting up as mind body, in Plato you get it much more as the soul and the higher part of the soul as opposed to the senses, right? But that there is part of us that is equipped to comprehend higher truths, and part of us that tends to deceive us and lead us away from those higher truths, and that we actually need to subdue the lower part of the self in order to be governed by the higher part of the self.
So the implication is not necessarily that you learn to live with the contradictions or tensions between these positions, but that you hope that one wins out over the other.
Yeah, and in all of these approaches, there is a clear hierarchical organization as well. There's a part of the self that's made to rule, and a part of the self that needs to be mastered in order for you to realize your higher purposes, or for you to be saved, or for you to appreciate the truth, right? And obviously I'm moving very quickly between the different perspectives to emphasize this basic idea. One part of the self is essential, is higher, is divine, is rational. And the only path to self mastery is by elevating that part of the self and putting it in charge. One of the things that Nietzsche is ultimately going to say is that we are plural, and there's no reason to elevate one part of the self over others. And that when we elevate the rational, the logical over the emotional and appetitive, we're actually doing violence to the self. And when you do violence to the self, you end up with a disorganized self as opposed to a well-organized self. Is this helping to see
Yeah.
where this is going a little? Yeah.
Well, it's helpful to me in the sense that it helps to deal with the fact that a lot of my friends who are philosophically oriented talk about living with the contradictions and rejecting the binaries, and that seems to be a more modernist view of things. That's just tough, guy. You seek resolution, forget it, man. It isn't there.
And I'm gonna say, as opposed to modernist, postmodernist.
Yeah.
It's probably the label.
That's what.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean modern in the sense of the last 100 years, not
Yeah.
the modern period. Yeah.
And if we wanted to be philosophically precise, we might say post-Nietzschean, right? Because and I'll just be as clear as possible. Nietzsche is inspired by, and then we could say Walt Whitman or Emerson as well, right? And Walt Whitman famously says, "I am large, I contain multitudes," right? And Nietzsche is saying, yes, and there's no reason to think one member of the multitudinous forces present in the self is supreme or higher, and everything else should be demoted. And when we do that, we're putting ourselves at war with ourselves. And ultimately, that's a path that exhausts itself and exhausts us.
Okay, thanks much, David.
You bet, David. Thanks for the question. I do want to hear the questions, because I want to make sure that this is making sense and that this is a rewarding path that we're on together. If there aren't any other questions at the moment, let me keep going. And where I want to go is the big juncture, right? And so as we're going to see that David just kind of introduced us to the idea that there's a postmodern philosophical tradition. There is an ancient and a medieval philosophical tradition, which we have concentrated on up until this moment, which I'm calling a foundationalist tradition. The idea that there's one solid foundation for knowledge, especially knowledge of self. And that means that there's one right answer to the question, how should we live? That involves organizing the self or the soul correctly, putting the higher aspect of human nature in charge of the lower aspects, mastering, disciplining, controlling those lower aspects so as to let reason be the dominant faculty. And that ultimately the confidence in the foundationalist project of both the ancients and the medieval theological tradition does not survive the transition to modernity. And that thinkers like Descartes and Hobbes open up serious cracks in those foundations that then people like Kant and Hegel are trying to repair. And so that's the transition I now want to introduce you to. And one thing you can ask is, well, what produces such a philosophical earthquake, because this really is a philosophical earthquake. And I'll start with just a quick description of what I'm going to call the pre-enlightenment ideas. And this starts with the idea that fundamental knowledge is esoteric, not available to most of us. Most of us require instruction, but also we remain kind of childlike in the sense that we can't think this stuff through for ourselves, and therefore we need to be provided with incentives. Very frequently need to be disciplined or intimidated into doing the right thing. Moral and political order comes from an external source, especially from God's plans for us, and we just align ourselves with those plans. We are not the makers of our own political, moral, social orders. Most humans must be compelled to bring themselves in line with their duties by external motivations. They need to be punished. They need to be inspired with fear, the fear of hell and damnation, to get them to do the right thing, the thing that's good for them, because they're not equipped to understand why it's the good thing, because the pleasures of the body certainly seem much more concrete and compelling than the prospects of salvation. The universe, including our world, is created, ordered, and infused with meaning. Look for the meaning in all things, right? That's what Aristotle is telling us to do. What's its purpose? What's its aim? And that idea is taken up in Christian theology. What was it created for? Why did God give us this world with these things in it? We need to look at everything as a text with a hidden message for us to discern. Finally, that history is cyclical and stagnant, that it repeats, things grow and decline and die, and then it starts anew, right? And so that's the kind of postulates of the worldview that comes out of this way of thinking. What challenged them? And I'm going to quickly tick through what I think are some non-philosophical developments that nevertheless shook the foundations of the confidence in the pre-enlightenment medieval Christian theological worldview. One of them is Renaissance humanism, and so right beginning in the 15th century, sculptures in Rome are dug up, old texts are discovered, greater attention is paid to mathematical ideas that have been preserved primarily actually by Muslim scholars. And we begin to say, wait a sec, their art is better than our art. Their poetry is better than our poetry. Their mathematics and science are more advanced than our science. Oh, and by the way, they're heathens, right? That they don't have these Christian foundations. How much do we really need these particular foundations? They seem to be doing pretty well, maybe even better than we are. Maybe we should be emulating them. Maybe there were conditions of liberty, of creativity that they had access to that we would do well to emulate. Second of all, and I think really this might take pride of place, there's the Reformation, right? That there's a schism within Christianity that ultimately tears Europe apart. There are literally hundreds of years of religious warfare that result, with Catholics trying to forcefully convert Protestants at the point of a bayonet, and the Protestants rather die or starve than be converted. Internecine, bloodletting, terrible warfare. Some of these warfares, the 30 Years' War, apparently killed 50% of the population of the middle of Europe in a 30-year period, right? And so on the one hand, the idea that religion contains a unified and unifying answer to the fundamental questions about the nature of the universe and the place of human beings in it seems to be obviously refuted by the fact that we can't even agree on how to read the same holy text, right? The scripture is the same, and yet we're going to war over how to interpret it. And on the other hand, the fact that neither side wins seems to put paid to the idea that God is in the world and on the side of the right and true religion. If that were the case, then one side, the side that had it right, would have won. But in fact, we seem to have pretty much fought each other to a bloody standstill. Third, the scientific revolution, right, which is beginning around the same time, 16th, 17th centuries. And first of all, it seems to be indicating an entirely different model of knowledge, right? An empirical model of knowledge. Don't start by looking away from the world or into divine texts. Start by looking at the world, but don't interpret the world for its meaning, its purpose, what it was created for, but view it instead as governed by impersonal laws and try to discern or unpack those laws, a fundamentally distinct model of knowledge. And lo and behold, it allows us to do things, to build structures, to master forces, to improve our agriculture, to improve our commerce, our shipping, etc., in ways that the old worldview didn't. So now there's something of a rival to the old worldview. It has a fundamentally different ontology, maybe not a metaphysics, and it's proving quite productive. And then finally, something that emerges out of all of this and then becomes more philosophical is the power of modern skepticism. And so skepticism, right, is a tradition of philosophy that goes back to the Greeks and the Romans, but is employed variously by great modern philosophers, Descartes, Hobbes, Hume, to use doubt methodically. Let's doubt everything that we think we know and then see what survives that kind of critical scrutiny. And it turns out that skepticism, which is originally employed by Descartes, he thinks for constructive purposes, to figure out what survives the acid bath of radical questioning, it turns out perhaps to be more destructive than constructive. And certainly by the time we get to Hume, it appears that there's nothing that we tend to view as the foundation of our knowledge that can survive radical skeptical examination. And so we begin to get an alternative worldview emerging from the encounter of the ancient worldview with these challenges that loosen its power. And in this alternative worldview, very quickly, every person is equipped with sufficient reason, intellect, judgment to learn things for themselves, to know enough to be able to understand the world and our place in it. Social order is made by us. It doesn't come to us from God's plan for us. We are in charge. We can do the right thing for the right reason. We can be internally morally motivated. We don't need to be led by like sheep by shepherds in order to get to the safe pasture. We can get there for ourselves. The universe is made to be explained scientifically if we can use hypothesis testing, formulate laws, do experiments. The project of modern science appears to, at this point, be not just a rival, but a complete alternative to the old worldview that gives us much better and more secure knowledge. And by the way, if each person tries to know things for themselves, works to build a better social order is moral and uses science, we don't need to turn around the wheel of history again and again. We can start doing better and better and better, securing a more progressive future. And this then is, I think, the foundations on which modern philosophy, the philosophy of Descartes and Hume and Kant and Hegel rests. And that's where I want to take you next, and with a focus in particular on how they interpret the self, right? And how that tradition then maybe provides us with resources to think about what we value in our own humanity and subjectivity as we begin to consider what are we going to do with these very smart machines that we are increasingly building and interacting with. So I'll stop there today. As I said a few minutes ago to David, I would love to hear your questions or thoughts. What, is this making sense? Is this valuable? Are you happy that we're doing this together, among other things? Go ahead, Flossie. Just unmute yourself. You don't need to raise your hand. But you're still muted. Flossie, where'd you go? Okay, there you go. No, you're still muted. Can you hold the space bar down?
Yes,
There you go.
okay. I am thinking of how luxurious this kind of philosophical life is. The luxury of being able to review Descartes and Hegel and Nietzsche. It is so rich that I'm thinking that if you are part of the world where you have to fight for enough money to feed yourself and your family, you cannot reason on such a level. It is so luxurious. I come back to the luxury of Aschenbach and Death in Venice.
Mm-hmm.
You need to be educated from day one to be thinking in this fashion. It's scary. I thank you for reminding us how rich we are. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Flossie. And it's funny, you have me thinking, because of the overall reason for doing this, of current economists at Stanford. I'm going to struggle with his name because it's a Finnish name, but Eric Brynjolfsson is the best I think I can do, who formulates this concept of a digital Athens. So his claim is essentially that Athens gave us all of these great ideas in part because Athens had slaves, in part because Athens had conquered so many of its neighbors and demanded tributes from them, in part because it confined women to the household and forced them to do all the domestic labor so the men could spend their time in the market talking about interesting ideas. And that obviously we don't want to live in a society where we exploit the bulk of humanity in order for a small number of us to be able to live in this rich intellectual milieu. And Eric Brynjolfsson's idea is, well, wouldn't it be wonderful to live in a world in which machines, robots, and computers could do all the work that the slaves and the people who were excluded and marginalized did for the citizens of Athens? And of course, that's not an original idea to Brynjolfsson, right? Karl Marx had a similar idea that capitalism was developing productive technology that would allow us to minimize the amount of labor necessary to subsistence, and then we could all do it 10 hours a week and have the rest of the week off to do poetry and criticism and sculpture, right? And let us hope philosophies too. But yes, it is an interesting question, and I just want to point out to you that there's interesting literature on philosophy and children, and this is sometimes done by philosophers, sometimes done by psychologists, pointing out that actually children are kind of natural philosophers, right? That this incessant why, but also the calling into question the very nature of things, the suspension of just acceptance makes them ask the kind of questions and entertain the kind of ideas that philosophers tend to ask and entertain. And then, whether or not in essence we all start life with really good philosophical potential, even though very quickly a large portion of us are forced into other avenues. And I hope, even for those of you who have no acquaintance with philosophy, this stuff is interesting and significant. David, you've got your hand up again. Go ahead.
Well, I wanted to put in a good word for dealing with these ideas under the old aphorism that nothing is as practical as a good theory. But I think that in our discourse about that, I mean, I know that's a kind of a pipe dream of academics also, but it seems to me that it's up to us when we consider these philosophical ideas to ground them in everyday, action and activity and the like. So to the degree that we can come up with examples of how this dualism, for example, might influence our daily lives and actually make a difference in terms of how we act, how we interact with other people, stuff like that. It seems to me that that's the trick in making this stuff feel more personally relevant and the like. So to the degree that we can do that, I think these ideas will seem less ethereal and like so. If we could all sort of do our part in interacting with you to sort of bring it down to everyday life, I think that would be a good thing to do. And I wanted to echo what was just said about children and philosophy. I think 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds are natural cosmologists. They want to know, they want answers to the big questions in life. Where did we come from? Where are we going? What happens to us when we die? All those kinds of things. And it takes a lot of effort to sort of drill that cosmology out of them and get them into the kind of the skill and drill approach that we use in so many activities in early schooling. And so I think that what that says is that we shouldn't forget that young children want to know answers to these big questions. By the way, that's one of the reasons why folk tales and myths and the like are so popular, with one to deal with those essential questions of life, existence, and ontology and the like. So that's just a plug for not selling kids short on these things.
And thank you also, David, for the imperative of making this stuff concrete, right? Figuring out how we're going to use it, how we're going to think it through for us. And I'll take up the challenge for a moment with regards to Aristotle, and to point out that on the one hand, I am unconvinced by the idea that I can discern in human nature the highest purpose that perfects every member of the species, right? It seems to me that we are too different from each other, and that we contain many potentials, not all of which are compatible with each other, but maybe not all of which do we even discern fully at the moment, right? And so I hope that there will be new what John Stuart Mill called experiments in life on the near horizon, right? Obviously, our ideas about, for instance, sexual identity have been radically transformed in the last generation, and I think in a way that have opened up new forms of meaning and satisfaction for a whole new range of people. Having said that, I also have to say I do like the idea from Aristotle of working to perfect oneself, right? That we do have higher capabilities and potentials, and that they don't just fall off the tree ripe, that we have to work to develop them, to bring them into being, that we have to practice to generate better characters for ourselves, to be of more use to each other, as well as more satisfying to ourselves. And so that's right, one effort to begin to think through what I do with Aristotle in terms of thinking about which aspects of him I want to reject, and which aspects of his thought I maybe want to take on board and use in my toolkit of lenses through which to view myself. All right, so anybody else for today?
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment.
Who is that?
Sorry,
Oh, Iris,
having
that you?
trouble. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm getting trouble here with the Zoom picture.
It's
But-
okay. And now I see it's you, Iris. Go ahead.
It seems to me that our young people around the world have come to the conclusion that the traditional reasoning of Christianity, the Muslim traditions, are insufficient to grapple with climate change, population disruptions, and so forth. And they are falling away from standard religious answers for these things and seeking new awareness, new knowledge in science and in community. That's it.
Thank you. And I completely agree with this as a generalization about the more developed world. I'm less confident about the world as a whole and the level of religiosity, but it's certainly clear in the more developed world that the number of people who want to belong to an organized religion is going down year by year by year, certainly generation by generation. Having said that, that does not mean that people are simply becoming atheistic, right? I mean, just as a matter of what they say when they're asked about this on survey questions, they still have religious and metaphysical and spiritual needs and interests. They're just not finding that they're spoken to, that they're satisfied within organized religious traditions. And so this raises, a question: where are they going instead? And I think some of it is that they're constructing their own systems of belief, maybe integrating ideas from various religious as well as non-religious traditions. I do think it's fascinating to me. I'll just maybe end on this note. The Brooklyn Library has a philosophy night once a year. They invite both esteemed professional philosophers and amateur philosophers to present papers, and they have reading groups gather and discussion groups. I think this starts at 9 p.m. and it goes to 9 a.m. So it's an all-night philosophy party. And prior to COVID, this was the most popular event in the New York Public Library system as a whole. And I've been a couple times, and it's literally to say standing room only doesn't capture it. Like, these are events that are held in rooms that border the stacks, and you have people stacked in the stacks to listen to philosophy at 2 a.m. in the library. So maybe there's a hunger for philosophy as an alternative way, and I'll add literature and theater and drama. You know, that there are multiple modes of meaning making, and the fact that we lose dominant traditions does not mean we lose the appetite to find those resources somewhere in the world. Yeah, thank you for that, Iris. I'll let you guys go. Good being with you as always. Take care, be well, and we'll continue on this path unless something big arises in the news for us to discuss in the following weeks. Take care, everybody. Thank you. See you soon. Bye-bye.